Derk, thank you very much for coming to Moscow and visiting the Moscow Center for Consciousness and Moscow State University.
Thank you.
It's very pleasant to see you again. It has been 2 years, right?
2 years after our trip to Greenland, which
Yeah.
was fabulous. That's right.
Well, we have both good memories and looking forward to your lecturing here in Moscow. So we would like to start the conversation by a little bit of history. Can you tell us a little bit how you came to philosophy and got interested in the free will debate?
My interest in philosophy stems from my religious education. My father is a minister in a Calvinist church, and I was born in the Netherlands, so it's Dutch Calvinism, or that was one of my formative influences. And Calvinism is interesting because it's a really, I think, a kind of a difficult set of, it comprises a difficult set of doctrines to accept. And so one way to kind of negotiate difficult doctrines is through philosophy. And I think this is one of the roles that philosophy plays. People get taught points of view, often ideologies, and philosophy offers a way to think about those ideologies in a critical and constructive way. So I think that was the reason I went into philosophy in the first place. And subsequently I went to Calvin College, which was our denominational college in Michigan. And there were several very good philosophers there. And two of the people that influenced me there were Alvin Plantinga, who was one of my advisors, and Nicholas Walterstorff. And they taught me to think about not only religious issues, but general philosophical issues very carefully. And of course, both of them are excellent analytic philosophers, so it was a wonderful education I had there. From there, I went to UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles, and I had a number of influences there, including Robert and Marilyn Adams. And one interesting feature of the way they do philosophy is they make a point of integrating the history of philosophy with contemporary issues, and that's also a feature of my current work. I think it's a very important way to do philosophy, not to forget the history of philosophy, but to integrate the history of philosophy with the way we think about contemporary issues. Another influence of mine there was Tyler Burge, and he's important for me because he does philosophy of mind, not free will so much. I didn't get a lot of free will education as an undergraduate or as a graduate student. In fact, it wasn't a very hot issue in the 70s and 80s. But Tyler Burge is a philosopher of mind, and he sparked and cultivated my interest in philosophy of mind.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell us something about impact of great modern thinkers?
The great modern thinkers, yes.
You are a Kant scholar after that.
Kant scholar, yeah. I did my dissertation on Immanuel Kant's theory of the self and its powers, its mental powers, with Robert Adams and Tyler Burge. And more generally, I had an education in history of modern philosophy. That's the historical period I specialize in, i.e. The 17th and 18th centuries. But my specialty was Kant. And Kant was very influential both in my view of the mind generally, but also in my view of free will. Kant, of course, believes that he thinks that he's a determinist. Now, not all of us are determinists nowadays, even if we're scientifically minded, but he's a determinist about the so-called phenomenal world. But he thinks there's room for freedom because he doesn't think that the phenomenal world is all there is, right? So it's possible that we, as things in themselves, are free. And I think so he thinks, for one thing, that free will in the strong sense, in the libertarian sense, is a coherent view, and it's something that we can believe and maybe have to believe for practical reasons. Right? In order to believe that there is a moral law, Kant thinks that we have to believe that we're free in this strong, what he calls transcendental sense, and also to believe in what he calls moral responsibility. We have to believe that we're free. But another influence of mine was Spinoza. Right? So, interesting about Spinoza is that, from my point of view, he's a Jewish philosopher in a kind of Calvinist context, and I think that the fact that he wasn't so much part of the Calvinist context allowed him to think about those sorts of views in a critical way. So when I read Spinoza as a graduate student, I thought, wow, this is a great position. And my position on free will is very much the position of Spinoza. And it's different in some respects from the position of Kant, So Kant thinks that if all we're thinking about is science and the phenomenal world, then it seems that determinism is true. But Kant recoils from that. He doesn't want to accept that. Whereas Spinoza says, well, if we do accept it, it's not all that bad. In fact, that doctrine can, the doctrine that there isn't what he calls absolute free will can result in a certain kind of equanimity, a better sort of life for human beings. And so that's the perspective that I've explored in my work on free will.
And what about David Hume? It seems that you are rather opponent of Hume.
Of Hume,
Yes.
yeah. Okay, so I think Hume is another, Hume and also Hobbes, I think that they have a similar sort of view, compatibilist view, and their compatibilist view is really the state-of-the-art compatibilism for the modern period. So what they want to do is kind of rescue all of the legitimacy of our ordinary attitudes, in particular attitudes, what Strawson later on called the reactive attitudes, attitudes that presuppose that people deserve to be blamed, deserve to be praised for the bad and good things that they do. Strawson calls the attitudes indignation and resentment, and the Strawsonian view really has a precursor in Hume's inquiry. And so in choosing between Hume and Spinoza, I choose Spinoza. I think that the Humean way of rescuing the strong notion of moral responsibility, the basic desert notion of moral responsibility, I think it doesn't quite work. And so I gravitate toward the Spinozan view, according to which that part of moral responsibility gets rejected. And it's his argument, Spinoza's argument is that results in a better sort of ethics and a better sort of life.
Mm. So, in your opinion, what are the most important contributions that the contemporary philosophers made to the free will debate, and what are the most important books and papers?
Okay, good. So maybe we can think of the contemporary period as beginning in maybe about 1960. So before 1960, we have the shape of the free will debate. So we have the Humean compatibilism. I think that was at least an analytic philosophy. It's the state-of-the-art compatibilism. It really comes from Hobbes, and then it gets transformed in British philosophy and also continental philosophy. And we get a very nice expression of that sort of compatibilism, the view that free will and moral responsibility are compatible in Hume. Then we get a kind of libertarianism, and I think the kind of libertarianism really is developed in the 13th and 14th centuries by Franciscans. We see it in Suarez, and it gets passed on to the modern period in that way. And then we have also hard determinism. Hard determinism is a minority position in 1960. We have it in Spinoza, also some of the French philosophers like Baron Holbach. And there's some American philosophers who championed hard determinism in that period. Okay, so that's where we are in 1960. Then we get a number of important influences. One of them is the consequence argument. Okay? So you get a very careful argument for the claim on the part of incompatibilists for the claim that causal determination and the ability to do otherwise are incompatible. Okay? And that goes against the Humean compatibilist grain, because Humeans want to argue that the ability to do otherwise and causal determination are compatible. And they have a way of showing that. Okay? So in the post-1960 period, the first big influence is the consequence argument, which challenges then in analytic philosophy is a certain kind of compatibilist orthodoxy, according to which determinism and causal determination and the ability to do otherwise are compatible. And some of the main figures in developing that are Carl Genet and Peter van Inwagen. Hey, and another important change in this period is a result of Peter Strawson's famous essay, Freedom and Resentment. Right? And I like to think of freedom and resentment as a kind of Wittgensteinian way of thinking about moral responsibility. So you might think of hard determinists as moral responsibility skeptics, and Wittgenstein has a very general way of thinking about skepticism, that skepticism can be defeated if we think about practice. Right? What he wants to say is that in the end, as he puts it, the famous Wittgensteinian slogan is, justification has to come to an end somewhere, and in his view, generally it comes to the end. It comes to an end in human practices. So Strawson says, let's think about the practice of holding each other morally responsible. At the core of the practice, Strawson thinks, is these attitudes, these emotional attitudes that we have, like resentment and indignation and guilt. And he says, look, we have these reactive attitudes. There's no way of changing that. So there's really no ground. I mean, given human nature as manifested in these emotional attitudes, there really is no ground for skepticism about moral responsibility. So not even causal determination constitutes a threat to moral responsibility. And that was a great influence. In fact, Strawson's essay is much more influential now than it was, say, in the 10 years after it was presented. Because in the 60s, you don't see a lot of influence of Strawson, but now its influence is tremendous. Okay? So that's the second one. The third one is, it was generally thought that the ability to do otherwise is required for moral responsibility. And in fact, the ability to do otherwise is definitional of freedom. But then Harry Frankfurt challenged this with these so-called Frankfurt cases. Cases in which, it's a technical debate, but in which it's intuitive that an agent is morally responsible, even though the agent couldn't have done otherwise, due to certain interesting features of how these cases are set up. And that's also been very influential. So those are kind of three great influences, very important influences from the 1960s that shaped the subsequent debate and makes the subsequent debate very different from the way it was before 1960.
Mm-hmm. So,
you asked for some books. I mean, you asked for some books that are important. Okay. So then after that, so those are all three of those influences were originally presented in articles. Van Inwagen later presented the consequence argument in very rigorous form in his book, An Essay of Free Will, in 1983. One very important book. Another important book is two important books by John Fisher. Okay, so he entered the fray on the compatibilist side, a more sophisticated compatibilism than what we see before 1960, one which makes the responsiveness to reasons the main condition on moral responsibility. And what Fisher wants to argue is that the correct analysis of responsiveness to reasons is compatible determination, causal determination. So causal determination isn't going to be a threat to moral responsibility in his view. Okay, so you get a couple of John Fisher's books, one from 1994, and then a later one he writes with Mark Revisa in 1998, Freedom and Control, Responsibility and Control. Okay, a huge influence on the debate. Then a little later on you get Robert Kane, who has a very important book in 1996 called The Significance of Free Will, which is a defense of a libertarian view, and a libertarian view that's actually consistent as Kane presents it with science. Okay? So it's not an anti-scientific view. So it's another important development. Then you get Susan Wolf, for example, who is a very interesting account of moral responsibility along the same lines as maybe John Fisher's, 1990, Freedom Within Reasons, but her view is asymmetrical, that praiseworthiness isn't subject to the same sorts of conditions as blameworthiness, so that's a very interesting addition to the debate. So those are some of the very important influences from the 1980s and the first half of the 1990s.
And you should mention your own.
A little later on. I read this book called Living Without Free Will in 2001. And then you get a flood of books, really. I mean, since the year 2000, we've had many, many books on free will, like Randy Clark's book on libertarianism, Tim O'Connor's book on agent causation. Dan and Nelkin has an important book on developing the same line, a line that's similar to Susan Wolf's. So we get many, many books on free will since the year 2000. And so there's been a real flourishing of the debate in the last 15 or 20 years.
So speaking of your contribution, generally many thinkers suggest that the study of free will is important because it justifies justifies moral responsibility. you seem to see the justification for some sort of moral responsibility, but see a problem justifying free will and the basic desert. So can you explain the difference? I know we spoke about it yesterday a little bit, but maybe it would be interesting for our audience. So can you explain the difference between the notions of moral responsibility and the basic desert?
Okay, good. So I think our practice of holding each other morally responsible is very complex. And Strawson, as I mentioned, appeals to the practice of holding morally responsible in his theory, and I think it's important to think about how that practice works and what notions of moral responsibility it involves. Now, one notion of moral responsibility that it involves, which has been really, I think, the focus of the free will debate, is the basic desert notion, and the idea there is that people deserve to be praised or to be blamed for the bad and good actions that they perform, and this desert is basic in the sense that it's not in turn justified in terms of other considerations that are, say, consequentialist or contractualist. It's just a fundamental idea. And yesterday we spoke about the fact that Kant thinks that it's pretty intuitive that we ordinarily believe in basic desert when someone's committed a crime, in Kant's case, murder. Most of us think that that criminal, in some sense, deserves to be blamed and to be punished, irrespective of, let's say, forward-looking consequentialist considerations. Okay, so that's basic desert. But that's not all that's going on in our practice. If you think about children, for example, the way we treat kids, when children misbehave and when parents blame them and discipline them, are they interested mainly in giving them what they basically deserve? And I would argue typically not. They're mainly interested in moral formation, in training these kids to be better morally, right? Perhaps training them to have better dispositions to behave. So I would say that the notion of desert and basic desert doesn't play a central role in the disciplining of children. Now, what about in human relationships, like marital relationships, for example? If we're really angry, then desert plays a role, but I doubt if it typically plays a role. We're much more interested in moral formation and maybe reconciliation, right? And that's a forward-looking goal. And I think the goal of reconciliation also need not involve the notion of basic desert. Okay, so I think that there are goals that our practice of holding morally responsible has that don't involve desert or basic desert. And two of those goals are moral formation, right, very prominently, and also reconciliation. So I think that in the free will debate, what determinism, or causal determination, challenges most fundamentally is basic desert. Right? So we have this, when we think about, when we contemplate our being causally determined to behave as we do, we wonder whether we really basically deserve to be blamed or to be punished for our bad actions. But I think that moral formation, reconciliation, those goals are not challenged by the prospect of causal determination. Right? So if my view is true, and I take this to be the view of Spinoza, what gets ruled out by causal determination is basic desert, but the goals of moral formation and reconciliation, and also maybe protection, they're not ruled out. They're left untouched by causal determination. So what results, in my view, is maybe a revision of our practice of holding morally responsible. So we get rid of the basic desert aspects, but we retain and maybe emphasize these forward-looking goals of our practice, like protection, moral formation, and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. But why do you think that basic desert is important? Maybe the illusion of the basic desert would do just the same. So which types of punishments should be, in your opinion, eliminated if we find out that there's no justification for basic desert? Right.
Okay. So So when we justify the way we treat wrongdoers, So in the first instance, the major change would occur in the justification of our treatment of wrongdoers. We wouldn't think in terms of what people deserve or basically deserve. Rather, we'd think in terms of like what would make this person a better person, what would protect us and others from bad behavior of this sort, and what would result in our reconciliation with the wrongdoer. Okay? So justifications, the justification that we have, that we engage in for treating wrongdoers in certain ways, that would be altered on the kind of view that I advocate. Now, would this make a difference in how we treat criminals? Well, I suppose it depends on the jurisdiction. I think the really harsh penalties, like I doubt if the death penalty, for example, could be justified on the kind of view that I want to advocate. In the end, I think that and this requires a bit of argument, that if there is no such thing as basic desert and we can't use basic desert in the justification for criminal punishment, then really what's left is what I call an incapacitation theory, which there's an analogy to quarantine here. So it's legitimate, we believe, to quarantine carriers of dangerous diseases, even if those carriers of diseases aren't in any sense morally responsible for being carriers. So similarly, we're going to be justified in taking really dangerous people and incapacitating them, perhaps by detaining them, as long as they're dangerous. But it's not as if we should incapacitate all wrongdoers in this way. There are lots of ways of incapacitating dangerous people other than by detaining. Right? There's also treatment, like rehabilitative treatment. So I think rehabilitation would be a focus of the sort of criminology that I'd advocate based on what I think about free will.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. A question about your recent book, Free Will, Agency and Meaning in Life. Very interesting, very complex book. And after reading this book, I had an impression that its main goal could be reduced to a rather modest claim, to the attempt to prove that indignation as a reaction to wrongdoing is a kind of irrational emotion. Is that right impression or not?
That's certainly that's certainly kind of a central goal of the whole view. That's interesting as a kind of psychological thesis, that maybe I have a problem, as Spinoza did, with this kind of emotional reaction in human life, right? Indignation, and indignation is the key one. I mean, I think that the way that Strawson uses the term resentment is if somebody wrongs me, then my negative reactive attitude toward that person would count as resentment. And indignation, the way Strawson uses it, is a third-person attitude. So if somebody else is wronged, I might be indignant at the wrongdoer in that case. But we can use indignation. Yeah, so I'm kind of worried about indignation as an emotional attitude. Now, I think that, like, if you believe in evolutionary story about indignation, I think it, in a way, it makes sense that it would be indignant, because it's certainly a way to, it's at least a crude and rough way to try to get people to change their behavior, to protect ourselves against bad behavior. But I think the Spinozan view is that it's not the best way. We've got better ways that are available. Right? Now, the problem with indignation as a reaction is it's kind of like a blunt instrument, right? And it has some good effects because it does in fact protect, and maybe it gets people to react differently, but it also causes a certain kind of negative reaction. I think people are familiar with this from teenagers. If you have teenage kids, if you react to them with indignation or resentment, I think their immediate tendency is to react back to you and to resist you, right? You get the resistance reaction. And so I guess that's the worry about that. One worry that you might have about that sort of reactive attitude. So maybe if in our emotional reactions we focused on what we really want, and in fact, what according to the evolutionary theorists, the aim of the whole system is, like changing people's behavior and maybe reconciliation and protection. If we focused, if we kind of refined our emotional attitudes so as to realize those goals in the most, kind of best way, then and I suspect we'd be much less indignant and much less resentful. We'd substitute different sorts of attitudes for what I think of as those blunt instrument type attitudes.
Thank you. A question about your famous manipulation argument. How did you invent this argument? You cited Richard Taylor's metaphysics as one of its sources. Was the impact of Taylor really big?
Was it big? Yeah, I think that there are, if you scour the literature, I think that there were manipulation arguments in the free will literature prior to, about 1990 is the Richard Taylor case. I think that Carl Genet has a manipulation argument in his 1990 book. I suspect that a lot of philosophy teachers in their classes used manipulation analogies in arguing for incompatibilism. But you didn't get much of a systematic presentation of manipulation arguments before then. I think it's partly because incompatibilists, starting in about 1960 or so, relied more heavily on the consequence argument. They thought that the consequence argument was the strongest argument against say, Humean compatibilism. But with the introduction of Frankfurt's argument, right? The consequence argument, the ground was cut from under the consequence argument, because the consequence argument tries to show that causal determination and the ability to do otherwise are incompatible. But then if you believe what Frankfurt has to say, and a lot of compatibilists in this period accepted Frankfurt, the ability to do otherwise is irrelevant to moral responsibility. And so the consequence argument isn't so important anymore. So at this point you need a different sort of argument for incompatibilism. And Van Inwagen tried this direct argument, but I think people find the manipulation argument more interesting. And so maybe the manipulation argument, given Frankfurt's contribution, turns out to be the strongest sort of argument we have for incompatibilism. And
but do you remember when you, personally, invented?
Oh, when I thought about my version of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Your version.
Yeah, so that was in, I taught at the University of Vermont starting in 1985, I initially thought that in my introductory class, they'd get very interested in the issue as to whether God exists or not, But in that part of the United States, they weren't so interested in that question. But when I started talking about free will, they got very excited. So they're much more interested in free will than in philosophy of religion. So at that point, that was sometime maybe in 88 or 87 or 88 that I thought of this way of doing it. Because there were manipulation arguments, and I thought, you can actually add some cases to it to make it a little bit stronger. So you had a kind of an elaborate version of the manipulation argument. And I found that with my students, it had a lot of effect, and with my colleagues as well. So,
Very interesting. But why did you change the presentation of at least of the first case of your manipulation argument? In your recent texts, you present it rather differently than, for example, in your book Living Without Free Will, and in your paper, 1995 paper.
Okay,
why
so
is it so?
Yeah, so the way this manipulation argument works is this. So the question is, if we're confronted with causal determination, the possibility that all of our actions are causally determined by factors beyond our control, should we give up on basic desert moral responsibility? And if you look at the experimental philosophy studies, a lot of people say, yeah, we should give up on it, but then a lot of people resist, okay? There are a lot of people who are natural compatibilists. So incompatibilists like me want to find some vehicle to get these people to be incompatibilists, okay? And how do you do this? Well, as I said a little earlier, our practice involves attitudes like indignation that presuppose basic desert. So it's very hard for us to get rid of this practice. So I think this practice is going to be quite resilient in the face of the thesis of causal determination. In fact, this is what John Fisher argues. He says, look, if I read in the New York Times tomorrow that scientists have definitively shown that causal determinism is true, I wouldn't change my practice of holding people more responsible. Okay? But Spinoza says, we believe we're free only because we're ignorant of the cause of our actions. So the worry is that the only reason why we're maintaining our practice of holding morally responsible, especially the basic desert aspect, is that we're really not coming to terms, or really not tracking the fact that we're causally determined in all of our actions. So how do you get people to believe this? Well, you posit an analogy. He says, the key idea behind the manipulation argument is to display the fact that causal determination is, from the point of view of the practice of holding morally responsible, exactly analogous to being causally determined by some other agent. So in my first case, I imagine a situation in which there is a team of neuroscientists, and they have the capacity to manipulate my brain at any particular time. And so they manipulate it so that there's actually a question as to whether I'm going to perform the bad action or not. And so at this point, they manipulate my brain by pushing a bunch of buttons so that I perform the wrong action instead of the right action. Right? And so then the question is, do you believe that in this situation the agent is morally responsible in the basic desert sense? And at least I want to say that the answer is no. Okay, that's the first case. And then there are other cases in which the manipulation isn't quite as stark and invasive. And the idea is that if you start with this extreme manipulation case, case one, and you've got a couple of other cases, then the claim that the stark sort of manipulation and ordinary causal determination are going to be similar enough, so you're going to make the same moral responsibility judgments in each kind of case. Okay, so there are a bunch of people, in fact about 5 or 6 people, that had this worry about this first case, that if you've got the manipulators manipulating this agent from moment to moment at all times, that this thing isn't really an agent. This person isn't. And so, there are certain people. Michael McKenna defended my old sort of case against this kind of argument, as did, and actually Ben Matheson. I don't know if you know him. He's got an article that's coming out in Field Studies in which he defends my old sort of case. And so maybe the old sort of case does work. But at this point, I retreated to a different kind of case in which, the manipulators have the capacity to manipulate the agent from moment to moment, but they hardly ever do so. They just do so at this crucial moment. So the coherence of the agent is thereby maintained. And they're manipulating the agent at this particular point in time. It's really no different from the way we're manipulated by our environment at particular points in time. So there's no argument. I think that this objection gets undercut by this new way of formulating the argument, that we clearly have a coherent agent, despite the fact that, and I at least hope that it's going to be the intuition that the agent isn't morally responsible because of this one-off type of manipulation that the case features.
Thank you.
So, how do you think that the problem of free will relates to the problem of mental causation? So do you think that the causal closure of physical world can be as much problem for basic desert as the causal determinism?
Yeah. Okay, so if reality is completely physical, and maybe a minimal thesis is that everything that exists is wholly physically realized or wholly physically constituted. This will also result in a problem for free will if we believe in causal closure, right? Namely that every physical event has a complete physical cause. That's right. If there's I suppose that if on the supposition of determinism, it's easier to formulate the causal closure principle, namely that every physical event has a deterministic physical cause. Okay, so if every physical event has a deterministic physical cause, and if all mental events are wholly physical in the sense that they're wholly physically realized or constituted, then it seems that you can set up a problem for free will in that way. Because if all the realizers of all of our mental states are causally determined, right? And if that chain of causal determination goes back in time to before we were born, it would seem to follow that all of our decisions are also causally determined by physical occurrences from the time before we were born. And that results in a challenge to free will.
But what if mental events are not identical with physical? Then it also seems to be a problem. The physical, the closure.
Yeah, if they're just if they're not identical, if they're just constituted, I suppose. But here's the question: suppose suppose causal closure of the physical is true, but dualism is true. Say substance dualism is true, right? So is this going to result in a problem for free will? I think it also results in a problem for free will, because at a certain point, I mean, even on the substance dualistic view, at a certain point there's going to be some sort of interaction between the mental and the physical, right? Mm-hmm. And so if your view is that because of the causal closure principle and because of determinism, all the physical events are causally determined by factors beyond your control, then the following worry results, right? Suppose I apparently freely decide to raise my hand, right? Then the raising of the hand, right, will be caused by factors, causally determined by factors that occurred before I was born. So what about my decision? Could I then have decided otherwise? Could I have refrained from raising my hand? I mean, given that the rising of the hand was causally determined by stuff that occurred, say, 1,000 years ago, right? So even if substance dualism is true, there's that sort of what I think of as a reconciliation problem for at least libertarian free will that results from causal closure plus determinism.
Mm-hmm. What about the problem of personal identity through time? Do you think that this problem can also pose a problem for moral responsibility and basic desert as well? And if yes, I mean, given that, say, both of these problems, the mental causation problem and the personal identity problem, can be an obstacle for for the basic desert sense, then why is determinism and the causal determinism is at the focus of the free will debate?
Yeah. So you might wonder why personal identity isn't at the focus. Yeah. So if you think about Hume's view, for example, like Hume, right, is very worried about personal identity famously, right? He says that in his chapter on personal identity in the treatise, he says, look, there really is no personal identity, because for personal identity you need some sort of exact similarity from time to time. He says that doesn't exist, right? So he says we're just a bundle of perceptions, and the perceptions are always changing. So there's not enough. There's no qualitative identity in the states of any person over time, and as a result, there's no personal identity over time. And so then he worries about how the fiction of personal identity is constructed, right? But if there's no personal identity over time, you might wonder how we can hold people morally responsible for actions that they've performed in the past. Right? If I'm not the same person as the person who raised his hand nastily 5 minutes ago, then how can I now be blamed for this? So that's also a problem. I mean, it's interesting that Hume presents this problem, personal identity, then gives kind of a precursor of the Straussonian account of moral responsibility, where the focus is our reactive attitudes. Now, at this point, you can say it's still true that we're going to have those reactive attitudes with respect to me now for what I apparently did back then. So why wouldn't this also undercut skepticism about moral responsibility? So it's a big puzzle in Hume, and Hume never resolved this worry about personal identity. He didn't really go back to it after the treatise. But yeah, so I think that personal identity would also the worry about personal identity would also result in a worry about moral responsibility, as it does in the work of Parfit, for example, Derk Pereboom, right? But yeah, so why hasn't this been the focus of the debate? Well, maybe it is, and some people so determinism somehow has captured people's imagination in the free will debate more than the problem of personal identity did, but maybe it's time to turn to personal identity, right, as a worry worth considering.
Is there any real difference between your current position and that of compatibilists? You admit that moral responsibility exists, that a kind of control is required for it, that such control could be called free will, that all this compatible with determinism. Of course, you are talking of forward-looking moral responsibility. But why do you think that compatibilists don't do the same?
Yeah, okay, so, right, there may be a bit of a terminological problem here. So if you go back to, let's say, the 1960s, you have someone like J.J.C. Smart in Australia calling himself a compatibilist, but it's not clear to me that his view is any different from mine, right? He passed away, but I was at a conference with him in 2005, and I tried to figure out whether there was any difference between his view and mine. So I asked him about the reactive attitudes, and I couldn't get him to commit on whether he thought the reactive attitudes were appropriate or not. So, and now he's not around anymore. So I don't know if his view really differs from mine. But look, I mean, Frank Jackson in 1998. So he calls himself a compatibilist, but. On his view, he thinks of compatibilism as a view that causal determination is compatible with a practice of holding morally responsible. That's good enough. And so that view is not different from mine, because I certainly think that causal determination is compatible with a practice of holding responsible. Mm-hmm. That's good enough. Okay, so I think that in my view that the key issue turns on the question of basic desert. And there, John Fisher is in print saying that the fact of causal determination wouldn't challenge the legitimacy of basic desert attitudes and beliefs. I think Dan and Nelkin has that view. I think Michael McKenna has that view. There are some people that are a bit more on the fence, like Eddie Namias. It's not clear to me that he wants to advocate basic desert. Daniel Dennett is another example. So I think that Eddie Namias and Daniel Dennett and Manuel Vargas, they are all champions of desert, but not of basic desert. Mm-hmm. And then my worry about that is, like, if you don't believe in basic desert, but in constructed desert based, say, on consequentialist considerations, like, suppose that you kind of understand the whole theory and you still, justify your treatment of other people as if they deserve it. Are you kind of faking it somehow? Is it real? So, but anyway, so I think that certainly positive and negative incentives can be justified on consequentialist grounds, and if the appropriateness of an incentive is in Daniel Dennett's vocabulary equivalent to a desert claim, then I'm going to be okay with the desert claim. Like, maybe the term desert is very squishy, it just has a broad range. Maybe it's not a very precise term. And if you can call a negative or a positive incentive that's justified on consequentialist ground, you can call that deserved, then I'm fine with desert. Non-basic desert.
Well, speaking about Dan, you name your position as a hard incompatibilist, and Dan is a compatibilist. But in a lot of aspects, your positions are very similar, mm-hmm. as you mentioned. And in Greenland, you even said that the difference might be purely verbal. So can you please just list or maybe name the important similarities and also differences in your viewpoints?
Okay,
Is that possible?
with Daniel Dennett. Yeah. So if you take the book Elbow Room from 1984, mm-hmm. like, one of the main focuses of that book is to argue that, let's say, ordinary deliberation about the future isn't really threatened by causal determination. So he's against a certain kind of fatalism. I agree with him completely on that. I think that that's right. In fact, in my new book, I have a whole chapter arguing that rational deliberation is wholly compatible with causal mm-hmm. determination. I think that's similar. So the Elbow Room doesn't focus so much on moral responsibility, but I know what he thinks about that. And he, as he said in Greenland, after my presentation on Pat Strickland's work, he thinks he's opposed to the idea of basic desert. Okay? So he and I agree on that. So now it seems that our views are exactly the same. But he wants to. So I suppose that, and this is also a possible difference with Manuel Vargas, the question is, do we retain our practices as they are on consequentialist grounds, or do they get revised? And look, I mean, I think our practices involve basic desert presuppositions. I don't know if Dan agrees with that, okay? So he may think that they involve just desert presuppositions and not basic desert presuppositions. So that would be an interesting sort of difference. But look, if Dan were willing to describe his view in the following way, that on the basis of consequentialist considerations, positive and negative incentives to behavior become legitimate, and sometimes negative incentives amount to punishment. We typically think of punishment, like in the case of fines for speeding, for example. Look, I'm gonna agree with him. And what about maybe we differ some on treatment of violent criminals. I don't know exactly what he thinks about that. My view is that the policy should be one of incapacitation plus rehabilitation. I'm wondering if he believes in something like hard treatment. The guy Michael Corrado at UNC has also a kind of a hard incompatibilist view, but he thinks that the hard treatment of criminals can still be justified, and it's better than the he argues, and this is in a forthcoming book and some articles, that that sort of view is better than the view according to which it's just incapacitation and rehabilitation that are the foci of criminal policy. Okay? So I don't know how Dan comes out on that, but I don't know, he might go either way, but at least the way he was talking originally sounds a little bit more like Corrado, that he'd be in favor of the hard treatment of criminals. But those differences aren't very major. So I think this is just a very interesting case of positions that are, I think we come from different backgrounds in our approach to the free will debate, but maybe the views we're coming up with are really very similar in the end. Interesting. The way he argues for his view is also different. He doesn't like, as you know, he doesn't like intuition pumps, right? He wouldn't like the manipulation argument. He doesn't like to argue that way, whereas I like to argue that way. So we're different in that respect.
Speaking about that, you're an armchair philosopher, so you rely on intuition pumps and thought experiments. But there's a lot of empirical work that is done in the same area. Do you think that cognitive science and neuroscience can in fact illuminate the discussion on free will, and what kind of help can be anticipated what kind of help can be anticipated for helping the resolution of the free will debate?
Yeah. Okay. So in recent decades, the neuroscientific debate on free will has focused on the work of people like Benjamin Libet and Daniel Wegner, and the Libet experiments appear to show that when we make decisions in ordinary case, the action has already been settled prior to a conscious decisions having been made. Okay? And the worry there is that if that's the case, then conscious decision making doesn't have a key role in the production of action. And if that's so, we're not really free. Now, this has been challenged by Al Mealy. He's had some very serious worries about the interpretation of the experiments, and it's cataloged in his book, Effective Intentions. And I'm very impressed with that book. Eddie Namias has some stuff to say about that as well. So, so there are challenges to the Libet's interpretations of his own experimental results, which I think are quite strong. But look, here's a very general worry that neuroscience has raised, that just so much of what goes into the production of action is unconscious, right? Even if decisions we make in paradigm cases are conscious, there's just so much of what we do that that results from unconscious occurrences in the brain. And that should make us worry about the extent to which we're free. So it's not only causal determination by factors beyond our control, or maybe the fact of luck that results from indeterminism, but also the fact that so much of what influences behavior is not conscious. Not conscious, so that's another important factor. Now, I think it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about whether these claims about unconsciousness or unconscious factors having an influence on behavior can be kind of marshaled in favor of a kind of rigorous argument against free will. And that work hasn't been done yet, I think, but it would be an interesting avenue to pursue. But just in general, the unconsciousness of influences in our actions is, I think, a pretty serious worry for our ordinary assumptions about free will.
A short question about your book on consciousness. You accept a definition of physical in this book, I mean, as non-mental at a fundamental level.
You're right.
So it's naturally to ask, how do you define mental?
Right. Yeah, that's hard. Okay, so that's the Jessica Wilson, University of Toronto. That's her characterization of physicalism. So it's kind of a negative characterization. So the idea there is, and maybe especially in philosophy of mind, that's been the key issue, right? Are there fundamental mental entities, or are all mental entities underlain and explained by physical goings-on in the world? Okay? And but then what is the mental? All right, and there, I suppose, I mean, we don't have a very good definition of the mental, but perhaps we have to think about the mental in terms of kind of paradigm cases. Like, what are paradigm cases of mental states? Well, perhaps conscious states, phenomenal states. It's one paradigm example. Maybe intentional states are another. So I think that in the history of the mind-body problem, I think it's really kind of intentionality and phenomenality that have posed the serious sorts of problems for physicalism. And so here's one way of doing it. So physicalism, if physicalism is true, then there are no fundamental intentional entities and no fundamental phenomenal entities.
But so you prefer a kind of ostensive definition of mental, but does it harmonize with your conception that, with your claim that all mental facts could be in principle derived from physical facts?
Right, yeah. Now, I'm not sure that that's true, but I think that would be the physicalist hope. Yeah, so in my book on conscious and the prospects of physicalism, I don't come out in favor of any particular ontology. I think that there are very serious problems for physicalism. But there I explore a couple of different ways of defending physicalism against the main arguments against it, the knowledge argument and the conceivability argument. Yeah, so you say that once more. Could you repeat that question that you had?
I see a kind of tension here. If we prefer ostensive definition of mental, so it suggests that we look at these entities as something non-reductive, but as something elementary. Yeah. But if you accept a physicalistic position, then we see that mental facts could be reduced to something more fundamental. And it seems to me that it's a kind of tension.
It is a tension. Yeah, I do think that there is a general tension. And now there are a few people who work on the mind-body problem that don't think that there is that sort of tension, but I certainly think that that's so. I think that it certainly seems to be the case that phenomenal states are not physical. It seems to be the case that that intentional states aren't physical. They just don't seem physical. Now, so I think that there is that tension. Or I think that there is going to be a big problem to show that in the end phenomenal states are physical. And the way, say, Dave Chalmers wants to do that is he thinks that physicalism is true if it's the case that all facts about phenomenal states can be, or mental states more generally, can be a priori derived from a physical base. I mean, at least for purposes of argument, I accept that characterization of the physical. And I think it's a problem. I think that if I'd accept physicalism, I'd say that there's at least an apparent epistemic gap, right, between the physical and the phenomenal. And if it can be closed, it's going to be difficult to do so. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to show that it can be closed. I don't think there's any simple way to close it in the way that, let's say, some of the analytic functionalists believe that it could. So yeah, I do think that there is that tension, and the tension results from the very strong impression of an epistemic gap.
Thank you.
You've been in philosophy for quite a while. What are the most important? What evolution have you? Your position evolved obviously. So what were the developments of your views? Most important changes that you had?
In my own views?
Yeah.
Yes.
Over the years. So one was when I think back to graduate school. I think that my position on free will then was an agent causal libertarian view. That's what I believed back then. And now I remember, Calvinism is a complicated sort of religious doctrine, but I remember reading, Arminius. I don't know if you've heard of Arminius. He's a great 16th century opponent of Calvinism and a proponent of libertarian free will. And so I remember reading several books about him, and I bought his complete works. And that was my rebellious period. I said, yes, I'm going to be an agent causal libertarian. That's the way to go. But then I read Spinoza, and I don't know exactly what happened. Who knows?
And Kant.
And Kant as well. Yes, Spinoza and Kant. Yeah, and Kant. And so Kant is actually, Kant thinks that we should be skeptical about whether we have free will. We have to, in the end, believe it, but we should at the same the purely kind of theoretical examination of these issues leads to a kind of skepticism about free will. But then we have practical reasons to believe that it's so. And so, in the end, what I wondered was whether those practical reasons that Kant had for believing in free will were strong practical reasons. And reading Spinoza made me think that that's not so, that those reasons aren't nearly as strong as Kant presented them to be. Okay, so that's an important development. On physicalism, I think that, I've been kind of on the fence on physicalism. I think that just purely methodologically, I really want to, I think maybe in some sense, even though I don't maybe believe that physicalism is true, I'm committed to physicalism, and I hope to show that it's true. I think it's very hard to show that it's true in the face of the arguments. I think the arguments are very strong. And I do think that, as I said earlier on, it does seem to be the case that the mental is not physical, that the phenomenal is not physical. But I do think it's very hard to argue against Jackson and Chalmers and to show that physicalism is true. But at the same time, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question why so many participants in analytic philosophy are physicalists, given that they don't have a really good answer to the knowledge and conceivability argument. It's kind of a cultural thing almost, right? It's a lot of religious people in the United States, for example, are not physicalists, but people that aren't especially religious, and even a lot of religious people are committed physicalists. So, I mean, it's an interesting question why that's so. It certainly wasn't true before about 1950 or so, right? And it's really something like in the second half of the 20th century that a certain kind of physicalism became the kind of the default view, even though people didn't really have an answer to the main anti-physicalist arguments. But yeah, so it somehow seems that if you think about neuroscience, I mean, you think that neuroscience is going to tell us everything about the mind. I mean, it seems somehow plausible. But I don't know, maybe it's, once you examine that really carefully, it's just a bit of ideology. It's not really a justified belief. But nonetheless, I have a certain kind of commitment to to that sort of view, at least in the sense of trying to defend it as best I can.
Does hard incompatibilism affect your life?
I think so, yeah. I think so. I think it makes a difference to how I react to other people, and certainly how I think about, say, criminal punishment, treatment of criminals. So I do think it does affect my life. I try not to, in dealing with people, I try not to be indignant, and if I am, I'm embarrassed, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I try to kind of cultivate more of a kind of Spinozist way of dealing with other people, as opposed to one that embraces the reactive attitudes in the way that Strawson suggests.
Our traditional question about meaning of life, and we are sure that you know the answer.
Oh. Oh.
What is the meaning of life?
What is the meaning of life? Well, when I talk about the meaning of life, I suggest there are, I think one really important feature of the meaning of life consists in having good interpersonal relationships. Okay, so in that last chapter, The Meaning of Life, personal relationships are a focus. I think that for a lot of people, like if you think of what they really care about, personal relationships are an important thing. And so the question is, how do we cultivate them? Now, Strawson suggests at a certain point that without those reactive attitudes like indignation and guilt and resentment, you can't really have good interpersonal relationships. Then it'll just be a matter of the cold, objective attitude. And I want to argue against that. I think that that's not so. And then we also have, I think another very important aspect of the meaning in life is really what Jean-Paul Sartre said about projects, you know, that we have projects and we take them on.
So you agree with him?
Yeah,
at this point.
That point, I do,
Yes.
yeah, that's right. And I don't think our projects are set for us. I mean, there's at least some sense in which we select our own, maybe it's deterministic, and to select our own projects, and we can in an uncoerced way. And an important aspect of meaning in life is like the pursuit of those projects in a meaningful way, and also, you know, success. I think success in those projects leads to meaning in life. And I argue in that last chapter, and also in the analogous chapter in the earlier book, that not believing in free will, that really doesn't hamper those aspects of meaning in life, personal relationships and ambitions for achievement and success in projects.
And maybe our last questions. Could you tell us something about your current research?
Current research. So I'm still, you know, I continuously pursue the question about free will. You know, as we saw yesterday and today, there are a lot of people that disagree with me, and this forces me to say more about free will, and also to revise my views in certain ways. And same is true of consciousness. Tomorrow we'll talk about consciousness, and I have more to say about that. But I'm also interested in pursuing this some historical topics. Like one topic that's very interesting to me is, and this is also in connection with philosophy of mind, is the development of structuralism. Right, structuralism and post-structuralism has been very important in continental philosophy, a very important theme since Saussure, and Derrida's talked about it as well. So I'm just very interested in the origins of that sort of issue, and I think that it really does originate in Leibniz's interaction with Descartes' physics, and then Kant's reaction to Leibniz. So I'm very interested in thinking about the kind of genesis of this issue about structuralism and how important it became, especially in the early 20th century, and its implications for contemporary philosophy, and not only for the way people see the world and for contemporary science. And it's also a way of, and I really care about integrating what goes on in continental philosophy with what goes on in analytic philosophy. And I think this is a very nice avenue, because one of the great foci of continental philosophy has been this issue about structuralism and opposition to structuralism. So right now I'm thinking that's the next thing I'll do, the next book I'll write, something on that issue.
Well, thank you very much for
a
wonderful interview.
Great.
Thank you.
It's great.
Thank you. That's all.
Good. That work?
Thank you.
Thank you. You're great.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thanks very much.